For years, my stepmom made my life a living hell. She belittled me, manipulated my dad, and made me feel like I didn't belong in my own home. But now, everything has changed because her life is in my hands, and she knows it. When I was 13, my dad remarried. Losing my mom at such a young age had left a void in our family, and for years, it was just the two of us. So when Dad introduced me to Miranda, I was cautiously optimistic. Maybe she would bring some light back into his life, and mine. Miranda seemed perfect at first. She was beautiful, charming, and always had a warm smile that made everyone around her feel at ease. On our first meeting, she brought me a small bracelet with my birthstone, saying, "I saw this and thought of you. I hope we can be friends." Her kindness felt genuine, and I found myself hoping she'd be the maternal figure I'd been missing for so long. For the first few months, everything seemed fine. Miranda went out of her way to make me feel included, asking about my day at school and baking cookies for the three of us to share. Dad looked happier than I'd seen him in years, and I started to believe that this new chapter in our lives might actually work. But as the weeks turned into months, Miranda's perfect facade began to crack. At first, it was small, almost imperceptible shifts. Her compliments started feeling more like backhanded remarks. "Oh, you're wearing that? It's nice, I guess." Or, "You're so smart, but maybe you'd make more friends if you tried a little harder to fit in." She'd brush off my discomfort with a laugh, saying, "I'm just trying to help, sweetie." But her words lingered, planting seeds of self-doubt that I couldn't shake. The real shift came when she began subtly undermining my relationship with Dad. She'd wait until he wasn't around to criticize me. "You know, your dad works so hard, and you're not exactly making it easier on him. Maybe you could try being a little more helpful." At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then I noticed how differently she acted when Dad was in the room. She'd pile on praise, telling him how much she loved having me around and how hard she was trying to make me feel at home. One night, I overheard them talking in the kitchen. "I'm trying so hard with her, but she just pushes me away," Miranda said, her voice trembling with fake emotion. "Maybe I'm not cut out for this." I peeked around the corner to see Dad comforting her, his face full of concern. "It's just a phase," he said. "She's a teenager. She'll come around." But I wasn't pushing her away. In fact, I was doing everything I could to keep the peace. I helped with chores, stayed out of trouble, and even tried to include her in conversations. But no matter what I did, Miranda found ways to twist it against me. The worst part was seeing how much Dad believed her. He started looking at me differently, his patience wearing thinner with each passing day. Suddenly, minor mistakes became major issues. If I forgot to take out the trash, Miranda would make sure Dad heard about it. I asked her 3 times, but she just ignored me, she'd say, shaking her head. I wanted to tell him the truth, to make him see the side of Miranda that she hid so well. But every time I tried, her words rang in my ears. "Your dad has been through so much. Do you really want to make things harder for him?" By the time I realized what was happening, Miranda had already gained the upper hand. She wasn't interested in being a mother figure. She wanted control. And the easiest way for her to get it was to make me the enemy. The house no longer felt like home. It felt like a battleground, and I was losing. Miranda's true nature didn't emerge all at once. It crept in slowly, like a shadow growing longer as the day fades. At first, her remarks were small and easy to dismiss. "Don't you think you're being a bit lazy?" she'd say if I paused homework to grab a snack. Or, "Wow, another late start to the day," when I slept in on weekends. I brushed it off, telling myself she was just trying to adjust to living with a teenager. But then, the comments became more pointed, usually when Dad wasn't around. "Your dad works so hard, and you just leave your dishes in the sink. That's not very considerate, is it?" The worst part was that she always delivered these critiques with a calm, almost sweet tone, as if she were genuinely concerned for my well-being. But her words dug into me, leaving me questioning myself long after she'd walked away. When Dad was home, though, Miranda flipped a switch. She acted like the perfect stepmom, showering me with praise and affection in front of him. "She's such a bright girl," she'd say with a smile. "I just love how creative she is." At first, I thought it was her way of building a connection with him, but it didn't take long to see what she was really doing. She was setting herself up as the caring, selfless figure who was doing everything she could to help me, while subtly painting me as ungrateful and difficult. "She's so ungrateful," I overheard her telling Dad one night as I passed by the kitchen. "I'm trying my best, but it's like, she doesn't even care. I just want her to feel loved, but she pushes me away." My chest tightened as I froze in place, listening to the rest of their conversation. "She's a teenager," Dad said, though his voice lacked conviction. "They go through phases like this. Just give her time." "I hope you're right," Miranda replied, her tone heavy with fake sadness. "I just want to be a good stepmom. But it's hard when she doesn't meet me halfway." Her words planted a seed in my dad's mind. From that day forward, I noticed the change in him. He became more critical, less patient. If I forgot to clean my room or came home late from school, it wasn't just a mistake. It was a pattern of behavior that's concerned him. "I don't understand what's going on with you," he said one evening after Miranda complained about me, ignoring her all day. "She's trying so hard, and you're just shutting her out." "That's not true," I protested, my frustration boiling over. "I didn't ignore her. She barely said 2 words to me all day, and when she did, it was just to criticize me." But my words fell on deaf ears. "She's just trying to help," Dad said sternly. "You need to start appreciating what she does for this family." I felt like I was losing him, piece by piece. Miranda had him wrapped around her finger, and no matter what I said or did, it seemed like her version of events always won out. The worst moments were when Miranda turned even the smallest mistakes into major issues. If I forgot to take out the trash, she'd make sure Dad knew about it. "I asked her 3 times, she'd say, shaking her head. But I guess she had more important things to do. Her words always carried an edge of disappointment, like she was trying to show Dad how much of a burden I was. And it worked. One evening, after another one of Miranda's concerned talks with Dad, he sat me down in the living room. "Why are you making things so difficult?" he asked, his voice heavy with frustration. "I'm not," I insisted, tears welling up in my eyes. "She's the one making things up." "Miranda wouldn't lie about something like this," he said firmly. "You need to start respecting her." That was the moment I realized just how deeply Miranda's manipulation had taken root. My dad wasn't just siding with her, he was starting to see me through her eyes. I felt trapped. Miranda was building a narrative where she was the victim and I was the villain, and no matter what I did, I couldn't seem to break free from her web. By the time I turned 16, it was clear that Miranda had won. The household wasn't just under her control, it was her kingdom, and my dad and I were merely subjects living by her rules. She dictated everything, what we ate, where we went, even how my dad and I spent time together. Family dinners became a performance, with Miranda at the center, steering the conversation and ensuring it always revolved around her. "I planned this meal just for us," she'd say, subtly implying that any complaints or lack of gratitude would be an insult to her efforts. Her criticisms were constant. My clothes were either too casual or trying too hard. My friends were bad influences, even though they were some of the kindest people I knew. The way I spoke, whether too quiet or too loud, was always wrong in her eyes. "You should work on your tone," she'd say with a condescending smile. "You'll come across as more polite." The punishments were more insidious. Miranda rarely yelled or made her disapproval obvious. Instead, she acted as if every consequence was the result of my own carelessness. One time, I left my favorite sweater draped over the back of a chair. The next day, I found it ruined, stained with sticky orange juice. "You really should be more careful with your things," Miranda said when I confronted her, her voice dripping with feigned concern. I didn't see it there, and accidentally spilled my drink. Another time, I couldn't find my phone for days. I searched everywhere, retracing my steps and even asking Miranda if she'd seen it. "No idea," she said with a shrug, though I caught a flicker of amusement in her eyes. Eventually, she discovered it wedged under the couch cushions. "Maybe you should keep track of your belongings better," she said as she handed it back. These little acts weren't random. They were calculated. Miranda didn't just want control. She wanted to remind me that she held the power, and I couldn't do anything about it. Dad, of course, never saw any of this. To him, Miranda was the picture of patience and devotion. She would go out of her way to paint herself as the saintly stepmother, recounting exaggerated stories of how hard she was trying to connect with me. "I made her favorite dinner last night," she'd tell him, "but she barely touched it. I just don't know what I'm doing wrong." Dad would sigh and look at me with disappointment, saying, "Can't you at least try to meet her halfway? She's doing her best." It broke my heart to see how completely she'd fooled him. Every time I tried to tell him the truth, Miranda would twist it against me. If I mentioned her nitpicking, she'd accuse me of being too sensitive. If I pointed out her punishments, she'd feign confusion, claiming I must have misunderstood her intentions. "She's just acting out," Miranda would say to Dad when I wasn't around. It's normal for teenagers, but it's hard not to take it personally. Her manipulation worked. Dad began to see me as the problem, the rebellious teenager who didn't appreciate Miranda's efforts. Our once close relationship grew strained, and I started avoiding him altogether just to escape the constant tension. The worst part was how isolating it felt. I couldn't turn to my friends because I was too embarrassed to admit what was happening at home. Miranda had me convinced that no one would believe me anyway, especially not my dad. I learned to keep my head down and do whatever Miranda asked, hoping to avoid her wrath. But no matter how hard I tried, it was never enough. If I cleaned the kitchen, she'd find a spot I missed. If I finished my homework early, she'd accuse me of rushing through it. Every day felt like walking on eggshells, and every mistake was an opportunity for her to assert her control. I started to believe the version of myself she painted, that I was ungrateful, messy, and undeserving of my dad's attention. By the time I hit my senior year, I was counting down the days until I could leave for college. Escaping Miranda's grip felt like the only way to reclaim my life. But even as I made plans to leave, a small, nagging fear lingered in the back of my mind. Would I ever truly be free from her? When I turned 18, I packed my bags and left for college, feeling equal parts relief and fear. Moving out felt like escaping a prison, but Miranda's influence wasn't something I could shake off so easily. At first, the freedom was exhilarating. I didn't have to walk on eggshells, second-guess every action, or brace myself for her veiled criticisms. My dorm room, small and plain as it was, became a sanctuary. I decorated it with photos of friends and reminders of the life I was building, a life without Miranda's shadow looming over me. But the scars she left weren't so easily erased. Trusting people felt impossible. I was constantly afraid of saying or doing the wrong thing, convinced that if I messed up, the people in my life would turn on me the way Dad had. Miranda's voice lingered in my mind, an unwanted narrator pointing out my flaws and whispering that I wasn't good enough. Still, being on my own forced me to rebuild myself, piece by piece. I made friends who didn't judge me, who encouraged me to let my guard down. I threw myself into part-time jobs to stay independent, working late shifts at the campus library and weekends at a coffee shop. The work was tiring, but it gave me a sense of control over my life that I never had under Miranda's roof. Little by little, I began to trust myself again. I stopped doubting every decision, stopped apologizing for existing. For the first time in years, I started to feel like I was more than the version of me Miranda had crafted in her stories, ungrateful, difficult, and unworthy of love. But just as I started to find my footing, Miranda found a way to pull me back. It started with phone calls, always framed as just checking in. Your dad and I were talking about you, she'd say, her voice oozing false concern. He mentioned you're struggling with money. Are you sure you're working hard enough? College can't be that expensive if you're budgeting properly. I clenched the phone so tightly I thought it might crack. I'm fine, Miranda, I'd reply, keeping my voice steady. You don't need to worry about me. Well, I do worry, she'd insist, her tone shifting to one of condescension. I know you're trying, but sometimes trying isn't enough. Maybe you should ask your dad for more help, though I hate to see him stretched so thin because of you. Her words stirred up the old feelings of inadequacy I thought I'd left behind. I knew she was baiting me, trying to undermine my confidence the way she always had. But even from miles away, her voice had the power to make me question myself. I started avoiding her calls, letting them go to voicemail and only responding to Dad's texts. When Miranda realized I was pulling away, her comments became more pointed. You know, it's rude to ignore people who care about you, she said in one particularly cutting voicemail. I hope college isn't making you forget your family. Her manipulation didn't stop at phone calls. She'd drop hints to Dad, who'd then call me, worried about my well-being. Miranda said you seemed stressed when she talked to you, he'd say. Are you okay? Do you need anything? I'm fine, Dad, I'd reassure him, though the frustration bubbled beneath the surface. Miranda was still controlling the narrative, even from afar. Despite her attempts to pull me back under her control, I refused to let her win. I focused on the things that made me happy, my friends, my classes, and the small victories that came with living life on my own terms. Miranda might have left a mark on me, but for the first time, I felt like I was starting to break free. The call came on a gray afternoon as I sat in the library working on an essay. Seeing Dad's name on my screen didn't raise any alarms. It wasn't unusual for him to check in once a week. But as soon as I answered, I knew something was wrong. His voice trembled, a far cry from the steady, controlled tone I was used to. "It's Miranda," he said, his words coming out in rushed fragments. "She had an accident. She fell down the stairs." My stomach churned, not with concern for Miranda, but with dread at what would come next. "Is she okay?" I asked hesitantly, unsure how much empathy I could muster for the woman who had made my teenage years a nightmare. "She's alive," Dad said, though his relief was tinged with exhaustion. "But it's bad. She fractured her spine. The doctors say she won't be able to walk without assistance for a long time, if ever." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me felt a fleeting sense of justice, like the universe was finally holding Miranda accountable for her actions. But that thought was quickly replaced by guilt. No one deserved to go through something like that, not even her. "She needs help," Dad continued, his voice pleading now. "We can't afford a full-time caregiver, and I can't do it alone. Can you come home, just for a little while? Just until we figure out a plan." The thought of going back home made my chest tighten. The idea of living under the same roof as Miranda again, of potentially falling back into the same toxic dynamic, felt unbearable. "I don't know, Dad," I said cautiously. "I have classes and my job, it's not that simple." "I know it's a lot to ask," he said, his voice cracking. "But I wouldn't ask if I had any other choice. Please, just think about it." I hung up feeling torn. On one hand, Miranda didn't deserve my help after everything she'd put me through. On the other hand, Dad's desperation weighed heavily on me. He sounded so defeated, so unlike himself. Over the next few days, I tried to focus on school and work, but the decision loomed over me. Memories of Miranda's cruelty clashed with images of her confined to a wheelchair, stripped of the power she'd wielded for so long. I confided in my roommate, Jessica, who had heard plenty of stories about Miranda over the years. "You don't owe her anything," she said firmly. "If anyone deserves to clean up that mess, it's your dad. He let her treat you like garbage." She wasn't wrong, but it wasn't that simple. It wasn't just about Miranda. It was about Dad, who had always been there for me, even if he'd been blind to her manipulation. After a sleepless night of agonizing over the decision, I called Dad back. "I'll come home," I said, my voice heavy with resignation. "But just for a little while." "Thank you," he said, his relief palpable. "I'll take care of everything else. I just need you here." A week later, I stood on the doorstep of my childhood home, suitcase in hand. The house felt the same as it always had, but the atmosphere was different. The warmth I remembered from my early childhood was gone, replaced by a heavy, suffocating tension. Dad greeted me with a tight hug, his gratitude written all over his face. "It means so much that you're here," he said. Miranda was in the living room, her wheelchair parked by the couch. She looked frail, a shadow of the woman who used to dominate every corner of the house. But her eyes still held that familiar sharpness, and when she saw me, her lips curled into a faint smirk. Well, she said, her voice softer but no less cutting. "Look who decided to come home." I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. "I'm here for Dad," I said simply, refusing to let her bait me. "Of course you are," she replied, her tone dripping with condescension. The battle lines were drawn, but this time, things felt different. Miranda wasn't the one in control anymore. And for the first time, I realized that I held more power than she did. Walking back into my childhood home after years away felt like stepping into a time capsule. The furniture was the same. The pictures on the walls hadn't changed, and the scent of Dad's favorite coffee still lingered in the air. But the energy in the house was different, darker, quieter, weighed down by Miranda's accident. She was no longer the commanding presence who had ruled over every corner of our lives. Now, she sat in the living room, confined to a wheelchair, her movements stiff and deliberate. The confidence that once radiated from her was dimmed, but her eyes still held a glint of the Miranda I remembered, sharp, calculating, and always ready to strike. At first, I thought her situation might soften her. Maybe the vulnerability would make her more human. But within days of my return, I realized how wrong I was. The snide comments started almost immediately. "You're only here because your dad begged you," she said one evening as I helped her move from the wheelchair to the couch. "Don't act like you're doing this for me." Her words stung, but I refused to let her see it. "You're right," I replied evenly. "I'm here for Dad. So let's not make this harder than it has to be." She gave me a tight-lipped smile, her eyes narrowing. "So much attitude," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. I thought college would teach you some respect, but I guess some things never change. I bit my tongue, choosing to focus on adjusting the cushion behind her back instead of engaging further. I wasn't the scared, insecure teenager she used to torment, and I wasn't about to let her drag me back into old patterns. Despite my resolve, Miranda knew how to push my buttons. Every small task I did for her became an opportunity for criticism. If I brought her a glass of water, it wasn't cold enough. If I made her lunch, it wasn't what she wanted. One afternoon, as I helped her with her physical therapy exercises, she let out an exaggerated sigh. "You're lucky your dad convinced me to let you come back," she said. "Otherwise, I'd have insisted on a professional caregiver. At least they'd know what they were doing." Her digs no longer made me feel inadequate like they once did. Instead, they fueled my determination to show her that she no longer had power over me. "Then maybe you should have hired someone," I said with a shrug, keeping my tone casual. "But here we are." She glared at me, clearly irritated that I wasn't taking the bait. "Don't get too comfortable," she muttered. "You won't last." What Miranda didn't realize was that I had changed. I wasn't the frightened child who used to shrink under her gaze or the teenager desperate for approval. College had taught me independence, and I'd learned to stand on my own 2 feet without needing validation from her or anyone. Even as she tried to regain control with her barbed remarks, I saw through her attempts. She wasn't the all-powerful figure she used to be. She was vulnerable, and for the first time, I saw her for what she truly was, a deeply insecure woman who thrived on tearing others down to feel strong. That realization gave me strength. I wasn't just back under her roof. I was in control of how much space she occupied in my mind. Dad, meanwhile, seemed oblivious to the tension between us, just as he always had been. He was so focused on juggling work and caring for Miranda that he didn't notice the way she tried to undermine me at every turn. "Thank you for being here," he said one evening as we cleared the dinner table. "I know it's not easy, but it means the world to me." His gratitude reminded me why I'd come home in the first place. This wasn't about Miranda, it was about helping Dad when he needed me most. And if that meant enduring her sharp tongue and condescending remarks, so be it. Miranda might have thought she still had power over me, but this time, the game had changed. I wasn't playing by her rules anymore. As the days turned into weeks, Miranda's dependence on me became undeniable. Tasks she used to handle with ease, making her own meals, tidying up the living room, even brushing her hair, were now impossible without assistance. And, much to her displeasure, I was the one helping her. At first, I thought she'd refuse my help out of pride, but her situation left her no choice. She gritted her teeth every time I handed her a plate or adjusted her wheelchair. "You could at least do it properly." She'd snap if something wasn't to her liking. But I noticed something else beneath her sharp tone: resentment, not just at me, but at herself. Miranda had spent years making sure everyone around her felt powerless, but now, for the first time, she was the one who lacked control. The shift in power was almost poetic, but instead of feeling triumphant, I felt a deep, unsettling conflict within myself. Part of me wanted to make her pay for everything she'd put me through. It would have been so easy to accidentally forget her lunch or take my time when she needed something. I could have given her a taste of the helplessness she'd made me feel for years. But every time I considered stooping to her level, I stopped myself. I couldn't shake the voice in my head reminding me that revenge wouldn't heal the scars she'd left behind. It might feel satisfying in the moment, but it wouldn't undo the years of hurt. So, instead, I did what needed to be done. I helped her with her therapy exercises, fetched her water when she asked, and made sure her medications were taken on time. I kept my responses short and neutral, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing me react to her jabs. What surprised me most was how quickly Miranda's tone began to shift. She still snapped at me, but there were moments when her usual venom seemed diluted. One day, as I helped her from her wheelchair to the couch, she muttered, "I guess I should thank you for not dropping me." It wasn't much, but it was the closest thing to gratitude I'd ever heard from her. I didn't respond, choosing instead to focus on steadying her as she adjusted herself on the cushions. Over time, an uneasy truce seemed to form between us. She stopped criticizing every little thing I did, and I stopped bracing myself for attacks every time I entered the room. It wasn't peace, not even close, but it was different from the constant hostility I'd grown used to. Despite the truce, I couldn't ignore the irony of the situation. The woman who had spent years belittling me now relied on me for everything. Without me, she couldn't function. And while she would never admit it, I knew that reality gnawed at her. One evening, as I was clearing away the dinner plates, Miranda broke the silence. "I bet you're enjoying this," she said, her voice quieter than usual. I glanced at her, unsure how to respond. "Enjoying what?" "Seeing me like this," she said, gesturing to the wheelchair with a bitter laugh. "Helpless. Weak. Must feel like payback, doesn't it?" I set the plates down and turned to face her. "No," I said honestly. "It doesn't." She raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Why not?" "If I were you, I'd take the chance to make me miserable." "Because I'm not you," I said simply. For a moment, she said nothing, her expression unreadable. Then she turned her gaze toward the window, avoiding my eyes. I could tell my words had struck a nerve, but I didn't press further. In that moment, I realized that I didn't need revenge to feel vindicated. The power dynamic had already shifted, and that was enough. Miranda's reliance on me wasn't just physical, it was a constant reminder of how fragile her control over me had always been. The dynamic between us wasn't perfect, but it was evolving. And for the first time, I began to wonder if Miranda's fall had shaken more than just her body. It might have shaken the walls she'd spent years building around herself. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house felt louder than usual. I was helping Miranda into bed, adjusting the pillows and ensuring her legs were propped up just right to ease her discomfort. She'd been unusually quiet all evening, her usual sarcastic remarks and complaints absent. As I tucked the blanket around her, she broke the silence. "I've been horrible to you, haven't I?" she said, her voice so soft I almost thought I'd imagined it. I froze, my hands still clutching the edge of the blanket. Miranda wasn't one for self-reflection, let alone admitting fault. I didn't know how to respond. "Why are you saying this now?" I asked finally, my tone cautious and a little guarded. She sighed, her gaze fixed on the ceiling. "Because I don't have a choice anymore," she said. "I used to think I was untouchable, that nothing and no one could bring me down. But now," she gestured vaguely toward her wheelchair, her face tightening with a mixture of bitterness and vulnerability. "Now I see how much I need you. And it's made me think about how I treated you all those years." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I wasn't sure if they were genuine, or if this was just another manipulation tactic, but there was a tremor in her voice that felt different. "I'm sorry," she continued, her voice breaking slightly. "For how I treated you. For everything I said and did to make you feel like you weren't good enough. You didn't deserve that." Hearing her apology felt surreal. For years, I had imagined this moment, Miranda acknowledging the pain she caused and taking responsibility for it. But now that it was happening, it didn't feel the way I thought it would. I searched her face for sincerity. The sharpness in her eyes, the edge I'd always associated with her, was gone. In its place was something softer, almost fragile. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said honestly, my voice steady but calm. "What you did to me, it left scars. And an apology doesn't erase that." She nodded slowly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said. I needed to say it. For once, I wanted to admit that I was wrong." Her vulnerability caught me off guard. Miranda, the woman who had spent years tearing me down, was now admitting her faults and asking for something she'd never asked for before. Understanding. I stood there for a moment, processing her words. Part of me wanted to dismiss them, to hold on to the anger and resentment I'd carried for so long. But another part of me, the part that had grown stronger and more self-assured, realized that this wasn't about her. It was about me. "Thank you for saying that," I said finally, my voice quiet but firm. "It doesn't fix everything, but it means something." Miranda looked up at me, her eyes glistening. She nodded, but didn't say anything more. For once, silence felt like enough. As I turned off the light and closed the door behind me, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, closure, and an odd sense of sadness. Miranda's apology didn't erase the years of pain she caused, but it marked a turning point. For the first time, I felt like I could begin to let go of the past. Not for her sake, but for mine. Miranda's apology echoed in my mind for days. It was the moment I had fantasized about for years, a confession of guilt, an acknowledgement of the torment she had inflicted on me. I thought hearing her admit she was wrong would bring closure, maybe even vindication. But it didn't. Instead, her words left me feeling hollow. They didn't erase the memories of countless nights spent crying in my room, wondering what I had done to deserve her cruelty. They didn't undo the years of self-doubt and loneliness that had shaped me. And they certainly didn't make up for the fact that she had stolen so much of my relationship with Dad. Yet, as much as I wanted to hold on to my anger, I realized it wasn't serving me anymore. Miranda's apology didn't change the past, but it forced me to confront a question I had avoided for years. What kind of person did I want to be? It would have been easy to choose revenge. To let her feel the weight of every insult, every condescending remark she'd hurled at me. She was entirely dependent on me now, and I had the power to make her life as difficult as she had made mine. Part of me was tempted. It wasn't just about vengeance, it was about justice. Miranda had ruled my teenage years with an iron fist, tearing me down whenever she could. Now, the tables had turned. She couldn't lift herself from the wheelchair without help, let alone control the household like she used to. But as I watched her struggle with her new reality, something inside me shifted. Her vulnerability didn't make me pity her, but it made me see her differently. She wasn't the untouchable force I had feared for so long. She was human, flawed and broken in ways I hadn't noticed before. I thought about the kind of person Miranda had been, and I realized I didn't want to be anything like her. Revenge might feel good in the moment, but it wouldn't heal the wounds she'd left. If anything, it would only deepen them, keeping me tethered to the past I so desperately wanted to move on from. Choosing compassion wasn't about forgiving Miranda. It wasn't about excusing her actions or pretending everything was okay. It was about freeing myself from the anger and resentment that had taken up so much space in my heart. One evening, as I brought her dinner, she looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You're different," she said softly. I set the tray on the table next to her and raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "You're stronger," she said after a moment. "I spent so many years trying to tear you down, but now you're the one holding everything together." Her words caught me off guard. I didn't know if it was an observation, an admission, or some twisted attempt at reconciliation. But it didn't matter. I wasn't doing this for her approval. As I walked out of the room that night, I felt lighter. For the first time, I understood that I had the power to define my own story. Miranda didn't hold that power anymore, I did. Compassion wasn't a weakness, it was a choice. And in choosing it, I wasn't just letting go of my anger. I was reclaiming the parts of myself she had tried to break. The past would always be a part of me, but it didn't have to control me anymore. In the weeks that followed, life settled into an uneasy rhythm. Miranda and I weren't friends, and we certainly weren't family in the way I'd once hoped we could be. But there was a fragile piece between us, one born of necessity and, perhaps, reluctant understanding. Her reliance on me continued, and while it was never easy, I chose to help her with as much dignity as I could muster. Not for her sake, but for my own. Every meal I brought her, every time I adjusted her wheelchair or helped her with therapy, was a reminder that I had grown into someone she couldn't break, a person who refused to stoop to her level. Miranda didn't say much about her apology after that night. Occasionally, though, I caught her watching me with a strange look in her eyes, as if she were trying to piece together the person I'd become despite everything she'd done. There were still difficult moments. Sometimes, her sharp tongue would slip through, and I'd have to remind myself to breathe deeply and not let her words cut me the way they used to. Other times, I found myself overwhelmed by old memories, the pain of the past bubbling up when I least expected it. But with each passing day, the anger inside me loosened its grip. I wasn't letting Miranda off the hook for what she'd done. I was letting go of the hold her actions had on me. One evening, as I sat on the porch after helping Miranda to bed, Dad joined me. He handed me a mug of tea, his face lined with exhaustion, but full of gratitude. "I don't know how you do it," he said, breaking the silence. I shrugged, taking a sip of tea. "It's not about her," I said simply. "It's about me. About being the person I want to be, not the person she tried to make me." Dad nodded, his eyes misty. "I'm sorry for not seeing it sooner," he said quietly. "For not protecting you from her the way I should have." His words hit me harder than I expected, but I didn't hold them against him. "We can't change the past," I said. "But we can do better now." As time went on, I realized that forgiveness wasn't a single moment or decision. It was a process. I wasn't sure if I'd ever fully forgive Miranda, and maybe that was okay. What mattered was that I had stopped letting her define my life. Miranda's accident had forced her to confront her own vulnerabilities, just as it had forced me to confront mine. She leaned on me more than she liked, and I helped her more than I wanted. But somehow, we found a way to coexist. Looking back, I realized that her life being in my hands wasn't about control, it was about choice. I had the power to decide how her actions shaped me, and I chose to rise above them. In the end, I didn't need revenge to feel whole. I didn't need to make her suffer the way she'd made me suffer. The greatest victory was in letting go of the pain she caused and choosing to be better than the person she'd been. And with that choice, I finally found peace.